Egypt, during the reign of the warrior pharaohs. A palace is burning in the hills of Canaan. Its king is dead, his crown shattered beneath Egyptian boots. But the women are not killed. They are clothed in silk, perfumed, and marched south in silence. These are not prisoners of war. They are symbols, gifts to the god king. In Thebes, they will be stripped of their names, their gods, their past, not out of cruelty, but policy. This is how Pharaoh breaks a kingdom without lifting a sword. Tia had never seen war, only the soft tremble of it, the way her attendants began whispering more than usual, how the palace guards wore their blades at breakfast, and how her master, the king, drank wine before the sun had fully risen. She was 17, old enough to know that peace was just another performance. The concubines were dressed in petals and oils, but they all smelled of fear now. Her room overlooked the eastern gardens, where the doves used to feed. They had stopped coming. Soldiers replaced them, and not theirs. Bronze helmets, taller spears, a different kind of discipline. These were Egyptians. The women of the harem were not told, but everyone knew. The cooks cried over their bread. The eunuchs whispered prayers from foreign tongues. Even the slaves looked at her with a different kind of pity, not the usual kind, not the familiar kind that said you are a prisoner of gold, but the kind that said, soon, your cage will be gone and you'll miss it. That night, the king did not visit. No one played the harp. The lamps were not lit. Tia sat in the dark with the other women, listening to the wind carry screams from the city wall. It didn't last long. Egyptian sieges were fast. The silence after was worse. In the morning, a man with no armor came. He spoke gently, but his hands were firm. They were to bathe, to dress, to wear the blue silks, not the red. A priest would bless them, and they would be escorted to Thebes under Pharaoh's protection. Protection, he said, as if the word still had meaning. Tia obeyed. She let them paint her eyes, oil her skin, and tie her hair with golden rings. As the city smoldered behind her, she stepped into the ivory cart with the others. None of them spoke. None of them cried. They were not being taken to a dungeon. They were being taken to something worse, a place where their beauty would be weaponized, their wombs politicized, their silence glorified. Tia looked at her hands and realized they were shaking, not from fear, from understanding. She was not spoils of war. She was the message, a living decree. Pharaoh had not just defeated her king. He would wear his women like a second crown. The gates did not fall with a roar, but with a groan, the kind of sound that comes when something ancient is broken not by force, but by decision. The palace guards had fled before sunrise. The outer walls were abandoned. There was no final battle, only a quiet surrender that felt more like burial. Tia stood behind the carved cedar lattice of the women's quarters, watching smoke rise like a veil from the lower city. Below her, the courtyard where girls once danced in spring festivals was now littered with weapons, sandals, shattered pottery. She pressed her palm against the wood, not to cry, but to feel something solid. That was when she saw him, her king, dragged by his braided hair, knees scraping the mosaic tiles he once commissioned. His face was swollen, his robe torn, and behind him, an Egyptian commander walked as if inspecting livestock. No rage, no joy, just cold authority. They didn't kill him there. That would have made him a martyr. Instead, they paraded him, past the grain storehouses, past the sacred fig tree, past the very women who once bowed at his feet. The message was clear. This was not slaughter, this was structure. The king was no longer a man. He was evidence, proof that Pharaoh's reach had no border. The women were summoned shortly after. Not by name, their names no longer mattered. A steward, Egyptian, but speaking in perfect Canaanite, read from a scroll. The concubines of the conquered king would be taken under Pharaoh's household as tribute. They were not to resist. They were to be bathed, veiled, and delivered. It was phrased like a decree, but it felt more like a sacrifice. Tia was the first to be touched. Her veil was adjusted, her bracelets removed. Not stripped in cruelty, but repackaged like offerings before an altar. She didn't cry. Not yet. The procession moved through the ruined gatehouse, each woman in a separate cart, guarded not with chains but with floral wreaths and soft-spoken priests. Along the road, villagers watched in silence. Some bowed, some spat, a few turned away. Tia kept her gaze low, as she had been trained, but her thoughts refused obedience. She remembered her first day in the palace, how they told her she had been chosen, not purchased, that she was a flower in the garden of kings. Now she was a possession, passed from one empire to another without a whisper of protest. As Thebes drew nearer, the air thickened with myrrh and expectation. Tia clutched the edge of her seat. She understood now. This was not rescue, not captivity. This was absorption. Pharaoh had not just conquered a city, he had harvested its beauty, and she, perfumed and silent, was part of his harvest. The walls of the harem compound in Thebes were higher than any Tia had seen. They were not meant to keep the world out, they were meant to keep the women in. Painted with lotus flowers and falcons, they gave the illusion of beauty, but there were no doors without guards, no windows without bars. The sky above was the only thing that had not been filtered. Tia was led through a narrow passage lined with torches, past murals of other foreign women before her, Syrians, Nubians, Libyans, each one kneeling beneath the gaze of Pharaoh. Their faces were carved in the same style, smooth, blank, interchangeable. The priest who guided her said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence had already become law. Inside the harem, the air smelled of incense and order. The older women, already broken in, moved like shadows, polished, precise, controlled. They were not prisoners. They were citizens of an invisible country, where Pharaoh was father, god, and master. Tia was given a new name, not Egyptian, not Canaanite. Something invented for the sake of ease. Her true name was never spoken again. When she tried to whisper it to herself that night, it felt like a crime. The room they gave her was clean, cushioned, cool. The sheets were linen, and the water brought in a gold-handled jar, but comfort without freedom is a slow poison. She was told when to sleep, when to eat, when to bathe. She was assigned a tutor who spoke gently but with unyielding rules. Egyptian language, Egyptian posture, Egyptian worship. Each day was a ritual of erasure. They told her she was lucky, that many cities gave up their women as slaves. That Pharaoh, in his divine mercy, had elevated her to a daughter of the house. But Tia knew what that meant. She was a vessel now. Not of her own future, but of Pharaoh's legacy. Her value would not be measured in memory, but in reproduction. If she bore a child, she would be rewarded. If not, she would be forgotten. One evening, as the sun dyed gold across the Nile, she stood in the courtyard beneath a palm tree and watched a line of new girls arrive. Younger, frightened, wrapped in the same ceremonial veils. None of them spoke. None of them looked up. Tia saw her own reflection in them. Not long ago, she had walked that same path, her body intact but her name already fading. A steward passed and paused near her. "You are quiet," he said. She nodded. That was the point. Pharaoh did not take concubines to hear their voices. He took them to silence the voices of kings long dead. The ceremony was not for them. It was for the gods. At least, that's what they were told as priests painted their foreheads with ochre and dressed them in linen too fine to move in. Tia stood in a line of 11 women, each one a former concubine of a defeated prince, each one reshaped to resemble an Egyptian ideal. Their hair had been cut, oiled, and styled into thick braids. Their jewelry matched, as did their expressions, blank, worshipful, erased. They were led into the inner court of the temple at dusk, just as the sky turned the color of blood and gold. The torches flickered low. Incense coiled through the air like memory. In front of them stood a statue of Pharaoh carved from black granite, his face eternal, his smile tight and distant. Behind them, noblemen and scribes watched in silence. Tia did not look at them. She stared ahead, because that was the rule. Never break gaze. Never speak. Never think. The high priest stepped forward and raised a staff carved with the eye of Horus. He spoke in words she barely understood, something about harmony, order, divine union. But the meaning was clear. They were no longer foreign. They were offerings made clean, holy in their silence, worthy in their surrender. When it was done, musicians played soft notes from a harp. One by one, the women approached the pharaoh's statue, bowed, and placed lotus petals at its base. Not for his favor, but to bury what they had been. Each petal meant a memory, a father's voice, a mother's hands, a childhood song. Tia's hands trembled as she placed hers down. Her last petal fell sideways. She left it that way. That night, the temple walls were carved. New reliefs showed the concubines kneeling, arms outstretched. As Pharaoh sat on his throne, surrounded by symbols of conquest, Tia saw herself in the carving. Her face was not hers. It was a mask, the same as the others. In the scene, Pharaoh did not even look at them. His gaze was beyond toward the horizon, toward eternity. The next morning, the women returned to the harem compound with gold bangles on their wrists. A servant told them it was a sign of honor, but the bangles had no clasps. They did not open. They were not jewelry. They were proof. Tia sat in her room and stared at the pale mark on her finger where her old ring once was. It had been taken and melted down not to destroy it, but to reshape it into something useful. She understood now. That was what Pharaoh did, not just to rings, to women, to kingdoms, to memory. The child was born on the 7th day of the flood season. The Nile had risen high that year, washing silt into the temple courtyards, softening the edges of the stone like time itself was bleeding. Tia delivered him without sound. She was not allowed to cry out. A priestess held her legs, another held her wrists. When it was over, they praised the gods, not her. The boy was taken before she could hold him, not out of cruelty, out of protocol. He was to be cleansed, named, recorded. An Egyptian child of divine blood, son of Pharaoh, born from the loins of a foreign womb. That was how they phrased it. Not child of Tia, not son of Canaan. She was called mother, but only in function, not in identity. The boy was given to nurses of pure lineage, trained in court language and sacred verse. He would never speak his mother's tongue. He would never learn of the garden she once played in, or the song her nurse used to hum while braiding her hair. Tia saw him once, from across the harem garden. He was walking, laughing, chasing a scarab across the grass. His limbs were small, his head shaved except for a single braid. The royal tutor stood beside him, nodding with approval. When the boy stumbled, Tia's heart leapt, but her feet did not move. She was not permitted to approach. Later that evening, a servant left a bracelet outside her door. It was tiny, made of carnelian and gold. A gift, they said, from the child, more likely from the steward, a reminder that her purpose had been fulfilled. In the eyes of the court, she had done well. She had secured her place. She was no longer a nameless offering. She was now a mother of the house. But the walls remained. The rules remained. She was not called to see the child again, not directly, not alone. And in the archives of the palace, her name was etched beside his lineage, not as mother but as origin. Her blood now belonged to Pharaoh, her silence to Egypt. At night, Tia sat in her chamber and whispered lullabies into her palms, not to remember, but to resist forgetting. She traced her fingers along the stone wall, drawing invisible letters in a language no one here spoke. It was not rebellion. It was something quieter, a tether to what had been. She knew that in time, even her voice might vanish, but the boy would live. He would walk the halls with his head high, never knowing he was born from conquest, that his first cradle was silence, that his mother had watched his life unfold from behind a veil, worshipped by no one, remembered by none. Years passed like sand slipping through open fingers, slow, silent, irretrievable. Tia's body softened with time, but her posture never did. She walked the palace grounds with the quiet grace of someone who had been trained not to exist. Her hair, once wild and perfumed with cedar oil, was now bound in the thin braids of the matron class. Her robe was darker, thicker, woven with lotus patterns meant to signify her status, but no one looked at her, not truly. In the temple records, she was listed as a former vessel of Pharaoh's seed. Her name was noted in ink, then crossed out, replaced by a title. No one asked where she came from. No one mentioned the city that once burned. It had no name now, only a scar on an old war map. The boy she bore was now a youth of high regard. He trained with scribes, learned the art of war, and recited hymns with flawless rhythm. He passed by her once, in the garden, flanked by tutors. He did not slow, he did not turn, but his gaze brushed hers just for a moment and something flickered. Recognition was too much to hope for, but curiosity, maybe. A pause in the soul. That was all she could ask. She had given everything and asked for nothing in return. The other concubines had aged too. Some took poison when their usefulness ended. Others retreated into the priestess ranks, speaking prayers they no longer believed. A few found small freedoms in tending temple gardens or mentoring younger girls who did not yet understand that softness could be a prison. Tia chose silence. Not as surrender, but as memory. Each night, she pressed her fingertips to her throat, as if to remind herself that her voice still lived there, somewhere beneath the years. One evening, during the Feast of Satis, fireworks lit the Nile in blue and crimson. The court danced, musicians played. Tia stood alone on the palace balcony, watching reflections burn and vanish. Her life had been lived behind curtains, behind customs, behind the shadow of another man's name, but she had survived. She had outlasted the war, outlasted the king who bought her, outlasted the memory of who she was before Egypt swallowed her whole. She would not be named in the songs, not honored in tombs, but the blood that ran through her child would move through temples, through thrones, through time itself. That was her rebellion. That was her quiet revenge. She was never meant to be remembered, but you remember her now. If you believe stories like Tia's still matter, subscribe. And tell me in the comments which state you're watching from. I read them all.